Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about the living Torah Scroll doctrine. So we may have begun to realize that for many parts of the New Testament, there is this Hebraic context, that there is this context of the Torah, the context of loving Elohim in the way that he asked us to love him, present in many of the teachings that we find in many of the passages of the New Testament. Even though in the past we may have heard otherwise, even though in the past we were taught otherwise and believed otherwise, now we are beginning to recognize that Hebraic context. And in recognizing that, we may start to use that in the way we interpret all of the passages of the New Testament. And it would make sense that we would try to apply that, such as with the Word, such as in 1 John and in John. In John 1, where it says, "In a beginning was the Word," and it says that the Word became flesh. Or in 1 John, where it says, "The Word dwelt among us, and we handled the Word, and we saw the Word, and no one has seen Elohim at any time." Thinking about the Word in that Hebraic context, we might arrive at an idea like the living Torah Scroll. So a possible logical sequence we might go through in arriving at that, we might think, okay, the Word, maybe the Word of Elohim, and the Word of Elohim might be the Scripture. And of course, Scripture at that time, they wouldn't have thought of the 1646 Calvinist Bible, the Bible that the Calvinists came up with at that time, because it wasn't 1646 yet. So maybe they were thinking about Scripture in the sense of the Torah. And so maybe it's the living Torah Scroll. Maybe it's the Torah becoming flesh. And it would make sense that we would try to apply that Hebraic context. But just as in the past, we did not know about this Hebraic context, and we did not know to apply that context in how we interpreted things, there may also be another context that we're not yet aware of that we would want to apply. And also another thing to consider here is living Torah Scroll is not actually the wording that is used in these passages. The passages that refer to the Word that are concentrated in John and 1 John and the Pauline epistles, that they never actually describe it as the living Torah Scroll. Now, of course, we're arriving at that through a logical sequence, and just because it doesn't actually state it that way doesn't automatically make it invalid. But we do need to make that distinction. We do need to be aware of the actual wording as opposed to the wording we are arriving at in our interpretation. So what is that actual wording? The word for the Word is logos. Logos has this implication of word, like we might think of it in English. But it also has another association with it that would have been present in that historic context. Logos was actually an abstract concept. It was a concept that was present in many teachings for hundreds of years prior to the writings of the New Testament. So it would have been pervasive amongst the intellectuals of the time, the idea of the Logos being a type of divine order that's behind all things in the universe. And this Logos may be the context that we want to consider in how we interpret John, 1 John, and the Pauline epistles when they refer to the Logos. Now, we might consider this and think, well, maybe there was this concept called the Logos back then, and maybe people would have been aware of it indeed. But does that mean that Paul and the John and 1 John books are referring to it in that way? Is that actually what they're talking about? I want us to consider this list, that we might look over this list and begin to recall many verses in the New Testament that refer to these things, that refer to the Word as being, for example, a heavenly Adam, as a type of atom that, while in some ways similar to the other atom, that this atom is one that is redeeming, that it is a heavenly atom. And we might think of it in the sense of a high priest, that not only does the Word serve as a priest, and a high priest at that, but also a heavenly priest. And we also might think of it as archangelic, as having angelic attributes, and maybe even higher than that of the angels. Or we might think of it as light. We might think of it as light illuminating the darkness, or light showing the way, or showing the truth. And we might think of it as a mediator between Elohim and man. Or we might think of it as the firstborn over all creation, and that all things were created through the Word. As we are looking over this list and remembering many teachings and many passages that are especially concentrated in the books of John and 1 John and also the Pauline epistles, I want to draw to our attention that this list actually comes from how other works outside the New Testament, works that are not in the New Testament, refer to the Logos. This concept of the Logos had existed for hundreds of years prior to the writing of the New Testament. It existed in Greek philosophy and Greek theology well prior to that time. And over the years, there had been this increasing Greek influence on many Jewish groups. While many of these groups resisted and refused to accept this Greek influence, some of these Jewish groups embraced that influence, and they tried to embrace Greek philosophy and Greek theology and combine it with their beliefs about the Torah. And teachings like this, with the association of the Logos and associating it with the Torah, are a byproduct of that. Teachings like this existed apart from the New Testament, even though we see it very much mirrored. In some ways, these teachings are almost identical to teachings that we see otherwise. These teachings outside the New Testament very much mirror many of the teachings about the Logos in the books of John, 1 John, and the Pauline epistles. There is not only this Hebraic influence on the New Testament, but there is also a Greek influence that is strongly present for some parts of the New Testament. And this Greek influence is undeniable, and it goes beyond the issue of the Logos. Paul, for example, in many of his writings references Greek philosophy and Greek theology. And in some of his teachings, he actually quotes Greek theological works, Greek religious works. One prominent example of this is in the book of Acts, when he's teaching regarding the altar to the unknown Elohim. He gives this teaching and he quotes two Greek religious works in reference to it. And I'm pretty sure if someone is able to quote something on the spot, that they must be well acquainted with it, that someone would have had to have effectively memorized it beforehand and been well aware of that in order to quote it. So obviously he had a lot of knowledge about Greek theology. So it should be no coincidence that Greek philosophy and Greek theology worked its way into his teachings. So there is not only this Hebraic context for some of the New Testament, but there is also a strong Greek influence that we need to be aware of. Now, we are on the right track in seeking after the roots of the faith, in seeking after the relevance of this Hebraic root, the Torah, and the relevance of it. In realizing this, we are on the right track, but we cannot turn a blind eye to other things that are present in some of the books that were included in the New Testament. Just because there is this one context does not mean there is not also another context present for other parts of the New Testament. So in considering this, how is it that we are going to make the distinction? How is it that we're going to know the parts that agree with the Torah, the parts that agree with that root, that foundation? and the parts that are from some other source that may not agree with the Torah. The only way that we're going to know that is by learning the Torah through what it itself says. Thanks for watching, and remember the commands. Shalom.